David had reached his breaking point. For months, he had endured Olivia's indifference. The long nights of quiet dinners, the absence of affection, the endless emotional labor that he carried alone. Every attempt to talk about his feelings had been dismissed with a laugh, a joke, or a cutting remark. Olivia wasn't the same woman he had once fallen in love with, she had become a stranger, someone he barely recognized. At 42, David was no longer the man who would stay for the sake of peace, who would hope things would improve with time. No, he had spent years tolerating the emotional distance, convincing himself that one day, things would change, that she would come back to him. But the truth had sunk in, things had already changed, and they weren't going to change back. It had been a long time coming. The small signs had piled up, Olivia's dismissive attitude toward his concerns, the way she'd roll her eyes when he asked for a little more emotional connection, the way she had stopped trying to make him feel wanted. The laughter that echoed when he mentioned how unhappy he had been for months was the final straw. "I'm done," David said one evening, his voice steady, betraying no trace of the storm of emotions within him. Olivia had raised an eyebrow, then burst out laughing. She didn't even think for a second that he was serious. To her, it was a joke, one of David's usual outbursts that would blow over in a day or two. She wasn't afraid of losing him, after all, she hadn't lost him yet, had she? David felt a deep calm wash over him as he looked at her. For years, he had been waiting for her to see him, for her to care enough to fix the cracks that had grown between them. But this time, as the laughter echoed in his ears, he realized something, he had been waiting for someone who had long since stopped caring. And that wasn't him anymore. Without another word, David stood up, grabbed his jacket, and walked out of the door. There was no need for a scene, no need to argue. He had made his decision, and he was at peace with it. There was no more explaining, no more begging for her attention. His silence spoke volumes, louder than any words he could have mustered. As the door clicked shut behind him, Olivia's laughter died in her throat. She reached for her phone to call him, but then stopped. She was busy, she told herself. He was being dramatic. He'd come back. He always did. David didn't look back. His mind was already focused on the future. He wasn't sure exactly what it would look like, but it would be his, free from the weight of Olivia's mockery and indifference. David didn't look back, not once. It was strange at first, this silence. The phone calls, the texts, the messages that Olivia left scattered across his voicemail, they all went unanswered. For the first time in a long time, David felt a deep, almost tangible sense of relief. His phone, which had once been a constant source of anxiety, now sat quietly on his kitchen counter. The buzzing and ringing were like ghosts from a past life that no longer had any claim over him. He didn't need to justify his decision anymore. He didn't need to explain himself, to try to make Olivia understand his pain or his frustration. The emotional work that he had carried alone for so long was no longer his responsibility. In fact, it had never been his to begin with. He realized now that he had been carrying the weight of a relationship that had always been uneven, one-sided, like an old, rusted scale that was always out of balance. Days passed, and Olivia continued to try to make contact. At first, there were a few simple texts, "Why aren't you answering?" and "You're being dramatic." "I'm not going to beg." David read them, but they were met with nothing but silence on his part. He could have easily responded, could have given her some explanation for his actions, but something in him refused. He had spent so many years offering explanations, apologizing for his own feelings, and hoping things would turn around. Now, he was taking back control. In the first few days, Olivia didn't seem to grasp the seriousness of it. He had ended things with finality, but to her, it was just another of David's moments of overthinking. She had never truly taken him seriously when he voiced his concerns, and the idea that he might actually walk away shook her to her core in ways she hadn't anticipated. But David didn't care about what she thought anymore. For the first time in a long time, he could breathe freely. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was liberating. He rediscovered the simple joy of solitude, of walking through his day without the emotional weight that had become a constant companion. He started to focus on his life again, the things he had put on hold for so long. There was a clarity in his mind that had been clouded by the relationship's toxicity. He began spending more time with friends, people who actually appreciated his company and valued him for who he was, not just for what he could offer them emotionally. He took up hobbies he had once abandoned, cycling through the park on weekend mornings, reading novels that had gathered dust on his shelf. He started to feel like himself again, and it was a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. The emotional weight he had been carrying for so long was finally gone, and for the first time, David could see clearly. The toxic patterns in his relationship with Olivia that had once felt like normal parts of their dynamic were now exposed for what they truly were: manipulation, neglect, and disregard for his feelings. Olivia's attempts to reach out became more frequent. Her calls started coming with a sense of urgency. "You don't mean it, do you?" she asked once, when David let a call ring through without answering. "This is just a phase. You'll come back to me." There was no apology in her words, no acknowledgement of how deeply he had been hurt. It was all about her, her needs, her comfort, her sense of control. David, however, remained silent. He no longer needed to reassure her or explain his side. Every text, every message, was just more noise, a distraction from the peace he had found within himself. And as days stretched into weeks, Olivia's attempts began to shift. At first, they were subtle, calls during the day when she knew he would be at work, hoping for a quick answer. She sent short, impersonal messages asking for updates on his life, as if nothing had changed. But then, when those went unanswered, the tone shifted. Her messages became more desperate. "I'm so sorry for everything. I've been thinking about what you said. Please, let's talk." The casual messages turned into long paragraphs of frustration and regret. She began to plead with him, trying to reconnect on the terms that suited her, but David wasn't having it. He didn't need to respond. He didn't owe her anything. He had spent too many years bending over backward for someone who never truly valued him. No more explanations. No more excuses. It wasn't easy at first. There were moments when David found himself staring at his phone, a flicker of doubt crossing his mind. Had he made the right choice? Would things really have been different if he had just communicated more? But then he would remind himself of how many times he had tried to make it work, of all the times he had put his needs last for the sake of keeping the peace. He realized then that the silence was not a punishment, it was a gift. He rediscovered hobbies, made plans with friends, and started seeing the world with fresh eyes. He was free, and with that freedom came an energy he hadn't felt in years. David was no longer tethered to the heavy emotional anchor that had been Olivia. He was alive again. Olivia's frustration continued to mount as the days went by. She tried every tactic she could think of, showing up at his apartment unannounced, leaving him voicemails that ranged from playful to demanding. It was clear that she wasn't taking him seriously, not yet. But each new attempt to draw him back only confirmed David's decision. She hadn't changed. She still didn't understand the depth of what he had been through. It was always about her, never about him. And as the silence stretched on, something inside of Olivia began to shift. It wasn't immediate. At first, she still believed David would eventually return to her, that he would come crawling back when he realized he had made a mistake. But over time, as she saw David's life moving forward without her, as she witnessed him thriving and finding his own peace, the mockery and laughter began to fade. It was replaced with the slow, painful realization that she had underestimated him. She had thought he would always stay, always put her first. But now, David had walked away, and there was nothing she could do to bring him back. The first few days without David had been a blur for Olivia. At first, she barely registered the absence, so certain was she that things would return to normal. She was used to David's moments of emotional outbursts. He had always been the kind of person who would voice his displeasure and, like clockwork, come back to the fold after a few hours of solitude. He'd always return. He had to. Where else would he go? But as the days stretched into a week, Olivia started to notice something different. There were no texts from David, no unexpected phone calls, no messages slipped through the cracks of their usual routine. The silence was deafening. She found herself pacing through their shared apartment, her fingers instinctively reaching for her phone, only to find it sitting there, still, untouched. She had called him several times, left messages, but David's phone had become a black hole. His once ever-present responses had disappeared entirely, replaced with the sharp sting of silence. The absence of his voice had started to gnaw at her. Why isn't he answering? Olivia muttered to herself, sitting on the couch, staring at her phone screen as though willing it to ring. But it didn't. For the first time, Olivia started to feel the weight of the situation. She tried to convince herself that it wasn't a big deal, that he would eventually give in and call her back, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was different this time. The confidence she once had in their dynamic, in her ability to control the relationship, was beginning to crumble. A few more days passed. She noticed small things that David had once taken care of, his half of the rent, their mutual responsibilities, falling to the wayside. Olivia found herself alone in the apartment, with the space once filled with laughter and bickering now eerily empty. She tried to fill it with work, with friends, but nothing felt the same. It was then that her frustration began to shift into something she didn't recognize. Olivia found herself obsessed with David's absence, trying to push past the emotions that were beginning to surface. Why hadn't he come back? Why wasn't he fighting for her like he always did? She told herself it was just a matter of time, that David would realize how silly he was being and would return to the fold, apologize for overreacting, make things right. But that time didn't come. Days turned into weeks. Olivia's calls continued to go unanswered. She even resorted to showing up at his apartment uninvited, knocking on his door and leaving little notes on his doorstep, begging him to return her calls. But still, there was nothing. David remained as distant as a ghost, and his absence began to fill her with a heavy, unfamiliar emptiness. She started to question herself, her decisions, and how she had let things go so wrong. But every time she asked herself those questions, a voice in her head would answer, "This is his fault. He's the one who ended it." But then, one evening, after what felt like an eternity of silence, something inside of Olivia snapped. She couldn't stand it anymore. She couldn't live in this state of uncertainty, constantly second-guessing herself, wondering if maybe, just maybe, David had truly moved on without her. She had been the one in control, hadn't she? David was supposed to be the one who needed her, the one who couldn't live without her. It wasn't supposed to be the other way around. With a mixture of anger and desperation, Olivia dialed his number again, determined to hear his voice. She didn't care about the guilt she felt in making yet another attempt to contact him. She just needed to hear him tell her that it had all been a misunderstanding, that he wasn't really done with her. But the phone rang through to voicemail, just as it had every other time. She left a message, her voice wavering slightly, but determined. "I don't know what game you're playing, David, but this is ridiculous. You can't just leave like this. We need to talk. Call me." She hung up and sat in the silence that followed, her phone pressed tightly to her ear, but there was nothing. No response. No reassurance. The following week, she saw something that hit her like a punch to the gut. David's social media had been updated. There, for all the world to see, was a picture of him at a coffee shop with a group of friends. His eyes were bright, his smile wide, a likeness to him that Olivia hadn't seen in months. There was no trace of the sadness, the exhaustion that had been etched into his face when they had last spoken. His life was moving forward, without her. The realization hit her harder than she expected. For the first time, Olivia was forced to confront the full weight of what she had lost. The distance, the jokes, the disregard for his feelings, it had all led to this. She had pushed him too far, taken him for granted for too long, assuming that he would always be there. But he wasn't. David had moved on. And it stung. As the weeks dragged on, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling of regret. She saw it now, how little attention she had given him when he had tried to communicate his needs, how often she had dismissed his concerns, making him feel like his feelings didn't matter. David had always been patient with her, always willing to forgive her impulsive behavior, her emotional detachment. But there was only so much a person could take. And he had taken his limit. What hurt the most was the finality of it. There was no fighting for them anymore. There was no reconciliation. Olivia couldn't even apologize. David wasn't interested in hearing it. He had walked away, and she had no power to change his mind. But in the depths of her regret, Olivia also realized something she hadn't seen before: the things she had mocked, the things she had dismissed in David's decision to leave, were exactly the things that had made him stronger. His decision to take control of his life, to finally prioritize his own peace over her mockery, was the courage she had never thought he had. And now it was too late. It took time for Olivia to understand the depth of her own feelings, and even longer to come to the realization that she had misjudged David in ways she never thought possible. At first, the sting of losing him felt like a temporary setback, a brief blip in the otherwise steady rhythm of her life. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, that sting slowly morphed into a dull ache that didn't seem to fade, no matter how hard she tried to ignore it. One evening, she sat alone in her apartment, a glass of wine in hand, her mind drifting back to the early days of their relationship. She remembered when things had been easy, when laughter had come naturally and their connection had felt so simple and effortless. But somewhere along the way, somewhere in the quiet moments when David had tried to reach out to her emotionally, she had let it slip away. She had taken it for granted, believing he would always be there, no matter how distant or detached she became. Her thoughts swirled as she tried to piece together the moments where things had gone wrong. She saw the signs now: his subtle frustrations, his attempts to bring up his feelings, the times he had asked for more but had been met with her impatience and indifference. There was a time, just months before their breakup, when he had looked at her, a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, and said, "I don't know how much longer I can do this." But instead of listening, she had laughed. She had dismissed him as if he were just overreacting, just another phase he would get over. She couldn't even remember what had made her laugh. Perhaps it was her own fear, the fear of admitting that their relationship was in trouble. But in that moment, she had silenced him with mockery, and the words had slipped from her lips: "You're being dramatic. Nothing's wrong. You just need to relax." Now, in the silence of her apartment, Olivia's heart sank as she realized how deeply those words must have hurt him. How many times had she belittled him, dismissed his concerns as if they didn't matter? How many times had she been too absorbed in her own life to even care that David was quietly suffocating in a relationship that had become nothing more than a hollow shell of what it used to be? It was a painful thought, but one she could no longer avoid. And it was only now, in the absence of his presence, that Olivia understood just how much he had given up for her. David had put up with her emotional neglect for far too long, trying to hold everything together while she carelessly tore it apart. She had underestimated him. She had thought he was weak, that he would always come back to her, even when she showed him so little respect. But she had been wrong. Olivia's phone buzzed, dragging her from her reverie. It was another message from a friend, a casual inquiry about how she was doing. But as her finger hovered over the screen, she found herself unable to respond. There was nothing anyone could say to make her feel better. No comforting words could undo the damage she had done. No amount of time would change the fact that David had moved on. And that hurt in a way she couldn't quite explain. Weeks went by, and Olivia continued to spiral in her regret. She noticed how much lighter David seemed without her in his life, how quickly he was able to pick up the pieces and move forward. He was thriving. He was smiling again, reconnecting with old friends, pursuing goals that had once been put on the back burner for her. She saw it in the photos he posted, the snippets of his life that now seemed so far removed from the person she once knew. His life was filled with purpose again, without her. For a long time, she had hoped that his absence would make him return. She had thought he would miss her, that he would realize what they had built together was worth salvaging. But as the days wore on, Olivia realized that she had misjudged David's strength. He had walked away because he was done. He had given all he could, and the moment he stopped caring was the moment his life began again. She had underestimated him. It was on a quiet Saturday afternoon, months after their breakup, that Olivia finally understood. She had been out for a walk in the park, just aimlessly wandering, when she saw David. He was sitting at a cafe, laughing with a group of people. He looked so different, so free. He had a calmness about him now, an ease she hadn't seen in him for years. His face was relaxed, his eyes bright with a new sense of purpose. He had moved on, and in that moment, Olivia realized just how much she had lost. David didn't see her. He didn't even glance in her direction. And for the first time, Olivia didn't feel the usual sting of rejection. Instead, she felt something else, something more profound. It was a sense of finality, of acceptance. David had walked away, and he had done it for himself, not because he wanted her back. He had chosen peace over the constant emotional turmoil she had dragged him through. And now, as she stood there, watching him with his friends, she realized how much stronger he had become without her. Olivia had spent so much time focusing on her own needs, her own desires, that she had failed to see how much David had sacrificed to keep their relationship alive. And now, as she watched him, a man fully alive again, she knew that the only thing she could do was let him go. There was no way back for them. There never had been. In that moment, Olivia finally understood. She had been wrong about him all along. And now, it was too late. It had been months since David had walked away, and Olivia had learned, albeit the hard way, that some things simply couldn't be undone. The path she had chosen, one of mockery, emotional neglect, and indifference, had led to a place of irreversible consequences. In the silence of her apartment, in the stillness of her life, Olivia began to fully comprehend the depth of her own actions and the weight of the regret that had taken root within her. The echoes of David's absence were louder than she expected. He had been a constant in her life for so long, and even though she had pushed him away in subtle ways over the years, his presence had always been a steady force. Now, with him gone, there was a void she couldn't fill. It wasn't just the small, familiar routines that she missed. It was the emotional connection, the sense of security, and most of all, the comfort of knowing that someone truly cared for her in a way that no one else ever had. David had finally done what she had never expected. He had let go. And with that single decision, he had found the peace he had been desperately searching for. It wasn't a peace that Olivia could give him, but one that he had claimed for himself. And as she sat in the stillness of her apartment, scrolling through old messages and photos of the two of them, she couldn't help but feel a sense of envy for what he had achieved, a life free of the emotional chaos she had burdened him with. Days passed, and Olivia began to pick up the pieces of her own life, but it felt different now. The weight of her regret wasn't something she could simply shake off. She realized that no matter what she did, no matter how many attempts she made to fill the emptiness, nothing could bring back what she had lost. She had failed to recognize David's worth when he was in front of her, and now, it was too late to fix it. Her friends noticed the change in her. They saw her quieter, more introspective, as though she were carrying a burden that no one else could understand. Olivia had always been the life of the party, the one who could talk her way through anything, but now, she found herself withdrawing from the things that once gave her joy. She avoided places she used to frequent with David, unable to face the memories that lingered there. The reality of the situation was harsh, but it was something she could no longer escape from. One evening, as Olivia sat alone at a bar, nursing her drink, she ran into an old acquaintance. It was someone she had known from years ago, a friend of David's who had always admired their relationship. The last time they had spoken, they had been in the midst of their usual small talk about life, but now, the conversation felt different. As the acquaintance casually asked how David was doing, Olivia was hit with the uncomfortable reality that everyone knew David had moved on, and in some ways, he had done it better than she had ever imagined. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. It was hard to admit, but in that moment, Olivia realized that David had done something she had never been able to do. He had let go completely. He had released her and their past without hesitation, without regret, while she had been left to linger in the past, holding on to something that no longer existed. The stark contrast between their journeys was overwhelming, and it only deepened her sense of loss. Months later, Olivia heard through mutual friends that David had started seeing someone new. The news hit her harder than she expected, like a punch to the gut. She couldn't bring herself to ask for details, but just knowing that he was moving forward, that he had found someone who made him happy, sent a ripple of pain through her chest. But as the days passed, she began to realize something important. This wasn't about David's new relationship. This wasn't about whether he was happier with someone else or whether she would ever have the chance to make things right. No, this was about her. This was about the consequences of her actions, the emotional toll she had taken on someone who had loved her, the years she had wasted while pretending that nothing was wrong. Olivia understood, at last, that regret wasn't something you could simply apologize away. It wasn't something that could be fixed with promises or gestures. It was a consequence, one that lingered in the quiet moments of reflection, in the spaces where the truth could no longer be ignored. As time passed, Olivia began to change. She couldn't undo the past, but she could learn from it. She took responsibility for her actions, not as a way to seek redemption, but as a way to better understand who she had been and who she wanted to become. She started therapy, focused on her emotional growth, and worked on becoming a better version of herself, one who didn't take others for granted, who learned to appreciate the value of love and connection. But even as she made progress, there was still a part of her that would always carry the regret. It was a heavy weight, but one that she would bear, knowing that it was the result of her own choices. And as much as it hurt, she understood now that it was the only way to truly learn, to live with the consequences and try to move forward. Olivia never reached out to David again. She knew that the finality of their breakup was a necessary step for both of them. He had moved on, and now, she had to find a way to do the same. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the pain still hit her unexpectedly, but she slowly started to rebuild her life. David had found his peace, and Olivia was determined to find hers, even if it took longer than she had ever anticipated. In the end, Olivia's journey was one of self-realization, of learning the hard way that you cannot take people for granted, and that the moment you stop caring is often the moment you lose what you once thought you could always hold on to.